Have you ever felt like the news you consume leans a certain way? Maybe, a bit too far left or perhaps too far right. We hear a lot about media bias. But what if the whole idea of a liberal media isn't quite what it seems? What if it's more of a carefully built narrative? One designed maybe to shift our whole political landscape.
It's a really provocative question to start with. And in this deep dive, you're actually experiencing a unique two-host AI conversation. We're powered by Google's NotebookLM, aiming for a deeper, more dynamic analysis of the material.
Exactly. And today we're diving into Eric Alterman's really influential 2003 book, What Liberal Media? The Truth About Bias in the News. This book, it's not just a critique. Alterman presents it as a thorough rebuttal, really, to that long-standing conservative claim about pervasive liberal bias in the U.S. mainstream media.
That's right. His core argument is pretty bold. He directly challenges what he flat-out calls a manufactured myth. He argues this narrative has been systematically pushed for decades. And his evidence, well, he suggests it points the other way entirely, towards a rightward shift in American media over time.
So he's saying this shift wasn't just some natural drift, but a deliberate outcome. Alterman connects it to, well-funded conservative operations and something he calls an intimidation effect, basically, pushback from those constant bias accusations.
Precisely. It's definitely a strong counter-argument to big conservative critics of that time, people like Bernard Goldberg and Coulter, and it really sets the stage for understanding, how we got to where we are with media today.
So to start, how does Alterman define the media when he's making this argument? He's quite specific, isn't he?
He is. He focuses mainly on the elite news outlets, the big names in cities like New York and Washington, the ones he sees as setting the national agenda. And for him, this idea of liberal bias within those outlets, it's not just wrong, he argues, it was actively, deliberately constructed.
Okay, let's unpack that. Manufactured.
Yeah.
How does Alterman say that happened?
Yeah.
Where does he trace the origins?
Well, he argues it didn't just spring up naturally. He points back, way back actually, to the period after Barry Goldwater's big loss in the 1964 presidential election. He sees the intensification of this narrative as a kind of coordinated conservative effort, a strategic response to feeling the media was unfair to them then.
And this effort involves significant resources, right?
Yeah.
Alterman talks about wealthy conservative donors.
Oh, absolutely. He names figures like Richard Mellon Scaife specifically, and talks about literally hundreds of millions of dollars being poured into building this whole infrastructure. We're talking about think tanks, powerful ones like the Heritage Foundation. He mentions their, $35 million annual budget back then, plus the American Enterprise Institute, the Cato Institute.
A full network then.
A vast network. And his point is this conservative infrastructure just dwarfed anything comparable on the liberal side in numbers, in funding, and that imbalance, he argues, had a huge impact on the whole information environment.
Okay, so that's the underlying structure. How does Alterman then look at the media outlets themselves? Let's start with television. What did he see happening there?
On TV, he talks about the rise of what he calls the punditocracy. It's a great term. His argument is these commentators, they weren't necessarily chosen for deep journalistic chops, but more for sounding authoritative, for being good at debate, ready for the camera.
So less about reporting, more about performance.
Kinda, yeah. He suggests this shift changed how news was presented. It started prioritizing opinion, maybe even rhetorical combat over that deep, nuanced reporting. It blurred the lines, between analysis and just straight-up partisan takes.
And who did Alterman see benefiting most from this pundit-driven environment? He pointed out a real imbalance, didn't he?
He certainly did. He highlights just how many conservative voices were dominating TV talk shows back then. You know the names: George Will, Bill O'Reilly, Chris Matthews, interestingly enough, Ann Coulter, Sean Hannity, Laura Ingraham. The list goes on. But then he makes this striking observation. Based on his research, no liberal actually had their own dedicated talk show until 2002. That, for him, spoke volumes about the supposed neutrality.
Right. So that's TV. What about print media? Did he find the same thing in major newspapers like, say, the New York Times or the Washington Post? People often point to them as liberal mainstays.
He tackles that head on. He directly challenges that common assumption about those specific papers. He provides really detailed analysis of their coverage, focusing especially on the Clinton years and that intense 2000 election. And his findings, based on looking closely at the text, he suggests their reporting was often neutral, or sometimes, maybe surprisingly, even leaned a bit conservative, which really flies in the face of the popular narrative.
So pulling these threads together, Alterman's core point about the claims of liberal bias is what exactly?
His central theme really is that these claims aren't some kind of natural observation about journalism. Instead, he argues they're a deliberate political strategy, one that's been carefully nurtured and, frankly, weaponized by conservative operatives over a long period.
And he argues this strategy led to a very real, documented rise of a powerful conservative media ecosystem.
Yes, and one that he argues just didn't have a real liberal equivalent back when he was writing. He documents this whole ecosystem. You've got the launch of Fox News, the explosion of conservative talk radio, those heavily funded think tanks we talked about, influential opinion magazines. In his view, the reach and the resources on the conservative side were just unmatched at the time.
Okay, and another key factor he brings in is corporate influence. The fact that media outlets are businesses. How does that play into bias, according to Alterman?
Right. He points out that media companies are businesses, fundamentally. They're often owned by wealthy individuals or large corporations, and those owners frequently have conservative economic interests. So he argues this creates a kind of built-in structural bias, a tendency towards pro-business, maybe more conservative viewpoints, almost regardless of the individual reporter's politics.
A subtle pressure from the top, maybe.
Exactly. A subtle but powerful influence on what gets covered and how. And then there's the impact on the journalists themselves. Alterman talks about an intimidation effect. What does he mean by that?
That's a really interesting point. If you're a journalist and you're constantly being accused of liberal bias,
Yeah.
how does that affect your work?
Well, Alterman argues that these relentless accusations create a climate where mainstream journalists start to, well, bend over backward to appear balanced. Maybe they consciously or even unconsciously overcompensate. They give disproportionate time or weight to conservative perspectives, sometimes seeking them out even when they aren't the most relevant voice, just to fend off criticism.
So it's a kind of subtle self-censorship, driven by the fear of being labeled.
That's the idea. The need to avoid that liberal bias tag can end up shaping the actual news narrative.
It's a complex picture he paints. Before we get into some specific examples where Altman applies these ideas, let's pause for a second. This kind of critical thinking, really digging into how information is shaped, is exactly what we try to foster over on Mindful Moments, our YouTube channel. It features AI book analysis, aiming to inspire reflection and rational thought. Just another way we're trying to bring you intellectually stimulating content and encourage that critical lens.
Definitely worth checking out. Okay, so back to Alterman's specific examples. He really uses case studies to drive his points home. He spends quite a bit of time on the media's treatment of the Clinton administration. What did he find there, especially around the Monica Lewinsky scandal?
Yeah, he argues the treatment of Clinton was remarkably hostile, particularly during the Lewinsky scandal. He suggests the media became almost obsessed, prioritizing that scandal coverage way above substantive policy discussions. He points to cable news running at 200/47, headlines in major papers focusing on personal aspects rather than, say, policy implications or the political fight itself.
And he contrasts that pretty sharply with how he saw later Republican administrations being covered, right?
He does. He argues subsequent GOP administrations received much more favorable, or at least less intensely critical, coverage on similar fronts.
And this ties into his analysis of the 2000 election and the Florida recount. That's another key case study for him, incredibly pivotal moment. His argument there is that the media consistently painted Al Gore in a negative light, while treating George W. Bush, as he put it, with kid gloves, kind of a gentle, uncritical approach, avoiding really tough scrutiny.
Right, and he backs this up with examples, doesn't he? From the big papers, the networks.
Oh yeah, specific examples from the New York Times, the Washington Post, TV networks. He believed they clearly showed an anti-Gore bias. He highlights, for instance, how Gore was often depicted as sort of stiff or maybe prone to exaggerating things, while Bush, in Alterman's reading, got much less flack for similar perceived gaffes or maybe policy vagueness. He saw it as a consistent pattern across the board.
And then, of course, everything changed after 9/11. How did Alterman see media coverage shifting then?
That's another crucial period he examines. He notes how, in the aftermath of September 11th, news organizations became much more deferential to the Bush administration. He argues there was noticeably less criticism of government policies, especially in that initial period of national crisis. Maybe a greater willingness to accept official statements on national security, for example, without the usual level of journalistic skepticism.
So looking at the bigger picture, this idea Alterman puts forward about working the refs, can you explain that a bit more? He sees it as a core strategy.
Right, working the refs. He argues the whole liberal media complaint isn't just griping. It's a key part of modern conservative political strategy. It's a deliberate, sustained effort to, well, intimidate journalists, to push coverage rightward. By constantly crying liberal bias, the goal is to make journalists second-guess themselves, overcompensate for balance, and ultimately give more space or credibility to conservative viewpoints.
And he argues this strategy has actually worked.
In his assessment, yes, remarkably successful. He believes it created a media landscape where conservative perspectives often get privileged, all in the name of achieving this sometimes elusive balance. And that subtly shapes public debate.
The book also touches on something deeper, a kind of fundamental conflict within journalism itself.
Yes, this tension between journalism's role as a democratic watchdog, holding power accountable, and the reality that it's largely a profit-driven industry owned by big corporations. How does Alterman see that playing out?
He argues it creates this unavoidable conflict of interest. When profit becomes the main driver, especially when owners have specific economic or political agendas, well, the public interest can potentially suffer. He suggests this structure can lead to journalism that's maybe less aggressive, less willing to challenge powerful interests or advertisers, undermining that essential watchdog function.
It's a really profound point about the structure of the industry itself. And reading the book now, what's striking is how much of it feels, well, prescient. He identified trends back in 2003 that have just exploded since then.
Absolutely. The continued growth of explicitly partisan media, the struggles of traditional journalism outlets, the intense polarization of our political discourse. Alterman was warning about the potential impact of these forces way back then.
Yeah, it really resonates. I saw one reviewer commented years later something like, "The warnings in this book were not heeded, and our media landscape is a giant disaster." A bit dramatic, maybe, but captures a feeling. His whole analysis of how accusations of bias can themselves shape coverage feels incredibly relevant today, with all the debates around fake news and declining trust in media.
That core argument that conservative complaints successfully nudged mainstream media rightward still feels very much part of the conversation. Now, how was the book received at the time? Predictably, I imagine.
Predictably divided, yes. Generally, positive reviews came from more liberal outlets. The Los Angeles Times called it well-documented, even-tempered, and witty. The New York Times Book Review said it was bold, counterintuitive, and cathartic.
And the New Yorker praised his, quote, argumentative vigor and the meticulous sourcing. But conservatives.
Not surprisingly, they largely dismissed it. Bill O'Reilly famously told Alterman he was living in the land of Oz. And even some reviewers who found his argument strong noted that while Alterman's own liberal perspective wasn't exactly hidden in the text.
Which is fair enough to point out. But ultimately, Alterman's central argument about the potentially manufactured nature of bias claims and their strategic use, it offers a really powerful framework, doesn't it? It encourages you, the listener, to really consider those dynamics when you're consuming news.
Absolutely. And remember, resources like Mindful Moments and our other podcasts are there precisely to help with that kind of critical analysis, providing tools to help you look deeper.
So it leaves us with a final thought to chew on. If the very perception of media bias can be used as a political tool, how does that change how we should approach the news today? And what responsibility do we all have as citizens trying to stay informed to really try and separate facts from maybe a manufactured narrative?
A crucial question for our times.
Click the link on screen for the in-depth book analysis. Subscribe, share, purchase via link, and above all, think critically.